Welcome to another edition of MOT Matters. As you'll be aware, we recently amalgamated the Class 5 manual and the 3, 4 and 7 manual. At the same time, some of the test methods and reasons for rejection were aligned to provide a more uniform approach to vehicle testing, as most testable items can equally apply to Class 5 as a Class 4. This could be a Class 5 if it was used privately. Now, some aspects of the combined inspection manual are specific to Class 5, and it's these items that we'll be featuring. VOSA technical trainer Brian Gray is going to take us through it. Hello Brian, lovely to see you again.
And you.
Well, let's start with what might seem obvious, but it's vital for us to keep in mind. What exactly is a Class 5?
Well, page 3 of the introduction and the inspection manual tells us that a Class 5 is a private passenger vehicle, ambulance, motor caravan, dual-purpose vehicle with 13 or more passenger seats.
And that doesn't include the driver, does it?
No, it doesn't. And interestingly enough, community buses and playbuses are also Class 5, but they're not on the list.
Yeah, that seems a bit odd because it's very unlikely for a playbus to have 13 or more passenger seats.
Yeah, but the definition of a playbus in motor vehicle test regs is a vehicle that was originally constructed to carry more than 12 passengers, which would be primarily adapted for the carriage of playthings for children.
Well, most of them are converted double-decker buses, so no problem there. What about the Class 5 lightweight? Because that isn't on the list either.
No, they're not, and that's because technically Class 5 light don't exist. It's a subcategory that we brought in to increase the availability of testing stations for users of small Class 5s.
So how do we define a Class 5 light? Is it by the number of seats?
Well, that's a reasonable assumption, Rob, mate, but it's not the number of seats. A Class 5 light is simply a Class 5 vehicle with a design gross weight not exceeding 5,000 kilograms.
And they can be tested by Class 7 testing stations?
Yeah, providing they've been approved to test Class 5 lights and it will fit their approved equipment. And it's important to remember that these testing stations cannot test any vehicle that requires a seatbelt installation check.
And they come under classes 5A and 4A, don't they?
You got it, mate, yeah. And they can only be tested by a full Class 5 VTS, but we can cover that later when we have a look at the seatbelt sections, talk about it in more detail.
And we're going to go through section by section?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Great.
So as we approach the front of this vehicle, Rob, do you notice any other lights we need to check?
Yes, the outline marker lights.
Yeah, they're covered by section 1.1b of the inspection manual, and the information column will tell us what vehicle these lights are required to be fitted to.
And there's a date and a dimension, isn't there?
Yeah, there certainly is. They're required on vehicles that exceeding 2.1 metres in width, first used on or after the 1st of April 1991, and they are in addition to the front and rear position lamps.
And I'm hoping, Brian, that you're going to tell me we don't have to actually get up there and tap them to see if they flicker.
I think health and safety might have something to say about that. No, we've removed the requirement to tap lights since the introduction of the amalgamated inspection manual.
So there's no need to tap any lights?
None at all, mate.
So what do we need to check?
Well, the checks for the end outline markers are exactly the same as the checks for the front and rear position lamps.
So they need to be showing white to the front and red to the rear?
Yeah, spot on. And that can be combined into one lamp.
And how high do they need to be positioned?
Well, the front lamps need to be positioned level with or higher than the upper edge of the windscreen, and the rear ones just as high as practicable.
So are end outline marker lamps the only difference in section 1.1 from testing Class 4s?
Well, there is one other thing, Robert, but it won't crop up very often.
What's that?
Well, a bus first used before the 1st of April 1955 is only required to have one rear position lamp, which must be on the centre line or the offside of the vehicle.
So what about the rest of the lighting section?
Well, there is another issue concerning headlamps, that a bus first used before October 1969 is only required to have one headlamp fitted.
Fair enough, but what's the definition of a bus?
And that's a good valid point, that, Rob. If we look in the abbreviations and definitions section, page 1 of the introduction and the manual, it tells us that a bus is a motor vehicle that's constructed or adapted to carry more than 8 seated passengers.
So a bus could even be a Class 4?
Oh yeah, it could if it had 9 to 12 passenger seats fitted, but you'll only come across the one headlamp usually on a large bus or coach.
These vehicles may only require one headlamp, but what do you do when 2 are fitted, as is the case on most of them?
Well, the additional headlamp is optional rather than obligatory, so we've got no need to test it, and it does not have to form part of a matched pair.
So what do we do in respect of the headlamp aim check?
Well, that's different. The headlamp aim check applies to all obligatory headlamps and any optional dip beam lamp that's fitted.
Okay, so the next section is steering and suspension. I imagine those checks are all the same.
I think I've mentioned before, life's not that simple, Rob, no.
Let's have a look then.
Coming in.
So what are the differences?
Well, there's only two, mate. And firstly, stations that only test Class 5 are not required to have turning plates.
So what about the checks that require the use of turning plates?
Well, if they've got turning plates and they're suitable for the size of vehicle being tested, then the tester should use them.
And what about if they're not available or not suitable?
Yeah, well, you can't use what you haven't got, can you? So lock-to-lock checks they could do on the floor, or if it's a beam axle with the vehicle jacked up. Remember, though, there's very few Class 5 only VTSs, so that will be a rare occurrence, and it definitely wouldn't apply in a station that's authorised to test Class 5 lightweights.
Because they'd automatically be testing Class 7s?
Dead right, mate. And the second one is the rear wheel bearings.
Oh, in what way?
Well, with a Class 5, we're not required to jack up the back axle, so it'll be clearly impossible to check the rear wheel bearings. And in the amalgamated inspection manual, it tells us that applies to any Class 4 with a design gross weight in excess of 5,000 kilograms.
Okay, I can see the sense in that. So if there are only two differences for steering and suspension, it must be time to move on to braking.
Dead right, mate. What do you think the differences are?
Well, these vehicles are generally quite a bit bigger than your average Class 4, so I imagine they have different braking systems.
Yeah, you may come across a vehicle fitted with a full air brake system or air over hydraulic brakes, but mind you, they were covered in the old Class 4 manual because they could quite easily have been fitted to a large vehicle such as a large motor caravan.
So what are the checks that you need to do on this type of system?
Well, you may have a secondary braking system that may be in place of or additional to the normal park brake lever, and you'd have to test that under section 3.2 of the manual, which is hand-operated brake control valves.
And presumably we need to test things like air pressure build-up and warning gauges.
Yeah, it's all laid out in section 3.3E of the manual, and the checks are the same regardless of test class.
And I know a lot of coaches are fitted with retarders or exhaust brakes. Do they need to be tested?
Yes, they do, and the checks apply to all additional braking devices, be they electric, friction, hydraulic retarders, or exhaust brake. So let's get under the vehicle and see what we got.
Okay. Now, Brian, this vehicle is pretty straightforward, but if it had an electromagnetic retarder, what would the checks be?
Well, it hasn't got one because they're generally found on larger vehicles, but it would be in this area if we did have one. And additional braking devices are covered by section 3.6I of the manual, and it tells us to check the device, its contacts and any other components for condition and security.
So clearly it would fail if any of the components were damaged or insecure.
Yeah, that's right, or if it was contaminated, say with oil. We also need to check the presence and condition of any heat shield if one is required.
And if the heat shield was obviously missing or damaged, that would be a reason for failure?
Yes, it would, and any of the components or surrounding areas showing signs of overheating as well.
Is the wiring part of the check?
Yes, it is, and it needs to be secure, in good condition and not badly positioned.
On an exhaust brake system, for example, if the lever that controlled the butterfly was impeded in its travel, would that be a reason for rejection?
Yeah, well, regardless of the type of device, if there was inadequate clearance between the device and other components, then it would fail. And what we'd also have to check is oil and exhaust leaks as well.
Anything else on the brakes, or is that it?
Well, that's all for the items we've got to inspect, but there are some differences with a brake performance test. What are they?
Well, in a nutshell, the imbalance figure on a steered axle is 30% as opposed to 25% on Class 7. We use the design gross weight for brake calculations, and if that isn't known, we calculate it from the unladen weight and the number of passengers. And if the vehicle has spring brakes, lock actuators or an air-assisted parking brake, we'd need to do an applied brake test using an approved Class 5 brake tester.
Well done, mate. The other thing to look out for is the brake efficiency requirement for buses first used before 1968, particularly where they've got a split braking system, as there is no specific efficiency requirement.
Isn't that where the parking brake has to be capable of preventing at least two wheels from turning when the vehicle's stationary?
That's it, mate, dead right. And that's it for brakes. The rest is as for Class 7s.
Great. Now, if I remember correctly, Section 4 is tyres.
That's it, tyres and road wheels. So let's make it easy on ourselves and jack the front of this vehicle up.
Great. Are there many differences in the checks for Class 5 wheels and tyres?
Well, overall, there's very little that's exclusive to Class 5. Almost everything overlaps with Class 4 and 7.
We need to check the load index and the speed rating.
Yeah, well done, mate. This is covered in section 4.1b of the manual, which only applies to Class 5 and 7.
And we need to determine the axle weights from the manufacturer's plate for that.
Yeah, right again, mate. We check the plate for the maximum axle weights in Great Britain, and then we check the tyre tables in the manual to make sure that this tyre can carry the weight. So let's go and have a look at the manufacturer's plate.
Well, the weight displayed for the front axle of this vehicle is 1750.
Yeah, and the load index on that tyre was 104/102.
So looking in Appendix D for 104, for a single wheel fitment, it can carry 1800, so we're okay there.
Yeah.
What about the speed rating?
Well, the speed rating on that tyre was R, which is fine, because excluding H, a marking of K or lower will usually be a failure.
And you say it will usually be a fail. Is that because it could be a restricted speed vehicle?
Spot on, mate. And we'll know that because it will be displaying a 50 plate on the rear.
And if I remember correctly, a restricted speed vehicle can have tyres with a rating of F or greater?
Spot on, mate. You're getting good at this, aren't you? I might as well go home.
And while I'm on a roll, don't we also have to consider that tyres with a lower speed rating of J or K can be acceptable for use at 70 miles an hour?
Yeah, we do. Can you remember why?
Well, these lower speed rating tyres can be used at 70 miles an hour if there's a reduction in the tyre's carrying capacity.
Yes, mate, that's right. Can you remember how much of a reduction?
Well, for a tyre displaying a J speed rating, which is suitable for a maximum speed of 62 miles an hour, to be used at 70 miles an hour requires a reduction in its load carrying capacity of 7%.
Spot on, mate. And for a tyre displaying a K speed rating?
Well, a K speed rating means a maximum speed of 68 miles an hour. So for that to be used at 70 miles an hour, it only requires a reduction in the load carrying capacity of 3%.
Brilliant. Well, fortunately, it doesn't affect a great number of vehicles, and all the information is on page 5 in section 4.1 of the manual anyway.
I also recall from a previous film that the tyre tread depth for a Class 5 is less than for a Class 7 vehicle.
Well done. I sense a redundancy notice coming here.
Vehicles with more than 8 passenger seats only require a tread depth of 1 millimetre, and there has to be visible tread across the whole tread area, with at least 1 millimetre of tread around a continuous circumferential band covering at least 3/4 of the breadth of tread.
Well done. And all the information is in section 4.1, page 9 anyway.
Aren't there a lot more checks on the road wheels for Class 5s than the other classes?
I got you there, mate. Now, that used to be the case, but in the amalgamated inspection manual, those additional checks are now applicable to Class 7s and to large Class 4s. It's all in section 4.2b.
OK, so shall we go inside the vehicle and look at the seatbelts?
Seems like the thing to do, Rob.
So section 5 then, seatbelts. Surely the checks are just the same as the other classes?
Oh, yeah, and the tester must check the condition of all seat belts fitted.
And what about the minimum fitment requirements?
Right, well, if we look at the new manual, the seat belt section in the amalgamated inspection manual has been redesigned to hopefully make it easier for testers to work out the minimum requirements. Section 5.1 has a series of flowcharts, and the vehicles that fall into Class 5, the information can be found on pages 6 and 7.
I see that it's split into 3 groups: minibuses, motor caravans and ambulances with 13 to 16 passenger seats, coaches and other buses.
Yeah, so the tester identifies which group the vehicle falls into, follows the relevant flowcharts, and then looks up the seatbelt fitment requirement and the tables in pages 9 and 10.
OK, well, this first group is self-explanatory, but I'm not sure what constitutes a coach, let alone other buses.
To be a coach, it must have more than 16 passenger seats, be capable of over 60 mile an hour, and have a design gross weight exceeding 7,500 kilograms.
So if it had 16 passenger seats or more, was capable of over 60 miles an hour, but had a design gross weight of 7,500 kilograms or less, what would that be?
Now that would be another bus. Unless it was designed for urban use with standing passengers, or was manufactured before the 1st of April 2001, then it wouldn't need any seatbelts at all. Simple, isn't it?
It seems to be, but let's follow it through for this vehicle, Brian. This is a 13-seater.
Yep.
First used in 2006.
Yep.
with a design gross weight of 4,900.
Right, so that makes it a minibus, exceeding 3,500 kilograms. When I look down, it says it needs belts G, L and S. So I look at the tables on page 9 and 10, and section G, L and S will tell me what type of belts are needed for each seat. This vehicle has got 3-point inertia reel belts on every seat, so it's fine.
Well, it is straightforward. And what about the seatbelt installation checks?
Right, well, seatbelt installation checks can only be carried out by full Class 5 testing stations, not by those authorised to test Class 5 lightweights. Thankfully, though, seatbelt installation checks are now almost a thing of the past.
Really? Why do you say that?
Well, a seatbelt installation check is required on a vehicle first used before the 1st of October 2001 that meets additional criteria, and they're so far and few between now.
And what about a vehicle newer than that, but that has had extra seatbelts fitted?
Well, it still wouldn't need an installation check. It would be up to the installer of the additional belts to ensure that they are fitted in accordance with type approval standards.
I see. So what are the other criteria?
Well, a vehicle will require an installation check if it has more than 8 passenger seats fitted, and it has more than the legally required number of seat belts fitted as per the charts on page 5 to 7 of section 5.1, and that there's no proof that all the seatbelt anchorage points have been type approved, or there's no proof that a seatbelt installation check has been previously carried out, or extra seatbelts have been fitted since a previous MOT installation check.
So how does the tester check that?
Well, that's simple. Just compare the number of seatbelts fitted to the information that's shown on the vehicle full identity screen when registering a vehicle for test on a VTS device.
And are we going to go through all of the seatbelt installation check requirements?
Not a chance, mate. That would be a film in its own right. As I said, they're quite rare nowadays. So if one comes along, then just refer to section 5.3 of the manual. Tell you what to do.
So it's on to section 6 now, which is body structure and general items. Anything there to concern us?
Well, there certainly is, mate. There are 3 subsections that relate to Class 5 only, and there's additional checks to be made in respect to doors. However, before we look at these, we ought to discuss the requirements of vehicle structure.
So have the requirements changed then?
Well, recently, Appendix C on structural integrity and corrosion in the Class 3, 4 and 7 manual were updated, but not in the old Class 5 manual. And now with the amalgamation of the 2 manuals, the criteria is the same across the board.
So Class 5s now use the criteria from the car and light commercial manual?
That's right, and it was a significant change for Class 5s, so it's worth having a look at it now.
As I remember, it's quite straightforward.
Yeah, it is, and the vehicle will fail if there's any deliberate modification, excessive corrosion, damage, fracture or inadequate repair not within a prescribed area, which adversely affects braking or steering by severely reducing the strength or continuity of a main load-bearing structural member.
So we're only concerned with the load-bearing structure that's not within the prescribed area, so clearly it would have to be fairly bad before it would fail.
That's right, remembering that minimum standards apply. And for prescribed areas, the checks are just the same as they are for Class 3, 4 and 7.
Now, you mentioned there are some additional checks with respect to the doors.
Yeah, that's right. Any idea what the additional checks might be?
The emergency doors at the back?
That's it. Let's go and have a look. Of course, they're only testable where they're fitted. There's no reason for rejection for one being missing. And also, mate, it doesn't have to be a door. It may be a window.
OK, and so we check that the emergency door or window can be opened from both the inside and out and closed using the relevant control.
Yeah, that's right. We also check that it latches securely in the closed position, and obviously we'll check it opens from the outside when we're outside the vehicle.
And what about if it's one of those break glass emergency exits like the one behind you?
Rather difficult to test without doing damage, that, don't you reckon?
Yeah, fair point. So non-testable item?
No, not at all. The presence of the break glass hammer will be a requirement from January 2012.
And talking of glass, there's a whole section on glazing in the manual, isn't there?
That's right, section 6.9, and it refers only to Class 5s.
And am I right in saying that section 8.3 doesn't apply to Class 5s?
Yeah, that's right. There's different criteria for checks on the windscreens of Class 5s, as well as checks to other windows, internal partitions, safety glass and safety glazing.
That sounds complicated.
Yeah, so let's start with driver's view of the road.
OK. So we're looking at the condition of the windscreen, right?
Well, not entirely. Tester needs to sit in the driver's seat and check that there's a reasonable view of the road through the windscreen and in windows wholly or partly on either side of the driver's seat.
So what are the failure criteria?
Well, the presence of an object which seriously restricts the driver's view of the road ahead, bearing in mind the original design of the vehicle, as well as any cracks, surface damage or discoloration which seriously restricts the driver's view to the front and to the side.
Well, that's not too bad. What about the internal partitions that you mentioned?
Well, we need to check the security of all windows, including the windscreen, side, rear, door, roof windows, and any internal screens and partitions.
And any of these will fail if they're insecure?
Only if it's likely to fall out in normal use or cause injury to any person that's on the vehicle. Similarly, a vehicle will fail for any cracks or damage to any glass or other transparent material that would present a danger.
What about if an internal partition is missing? Is that a reason for rejection?
Yeah, it would. Any guardrail or barrier, a window, internal screen or partition, missing, insecure or damaged to the extent that injury to passengers is likely would be a failure.
Now, what about this stuff about safety glass and safety glazing?
Oh, there's a few dates to remember here, Robert. 1st of January 1959, 1st of June 1978 and the 1st of April 1988. On vehicles used before 1959, glass fitted to the windscreen and other outside windows facing to the front must be made of safety glass.
Well, the obvious question is, how do we know that it's safety glass?
Well, it may be marked, and then again it may not. So we could only fail it if it was obviously not safety glass.
And what exactly is safety glass?
Well, safety glass is glass that, if it's fractured, doesn't fly into fragments likely to cause severe cuts.
So does that check apply to the top deck front windows on a double-decker bus?
Good point that, mate, but no, it doesn't.
So what about vehicles first used on or after the 1st of January 1959?
And then we need to check as far as practical that any glass used for windscreens or other outside windows is safety glass.
And we can only fail if it's obviously not safety glass, the same as before?
That's right, yeah.
And what about vehicles first used on or after the 1st of June 1978?
Right, well, on these vehicles, the windscreen or windows, wholly or partly on either side of the driver's seat, must be made of safety glass, bearing in mind that markings are required on safety glass fitted to vehicles first used on or after the 1st of June 1978. The manual gives us a list of markings to identify safety glass on page 2, section 6.9.
And what about the rest of the windows?
Well, they have to be made of safety glass or safety glazing, but there are no marking requirements for safety glazing.
I assume safety glazing is a material that doesn't fly into fragments likely to cause severe cuts.
You got it, mate. Safety glazing is a transparent material that's not made of glass.
What's this 1st of April 1988 date then?
Well, after this date, we need to check that any windows forming all or part of a screen, partition, door in the interior of the vehicle is made from safety glass or safety glazing.
Great, there's a lot of information here. If in any doubt, of course, check in the manual.
That's right.
So what's next, Brian?
On a Class 5, there's a couple of additional items to check in the driver's area, and the first of these is the speedometer, which is covered by section 6.7 of the manual, but it only applies to vehicles first used on or after the 1st of October 1937.
So that's nearly every Class 5 then. What do you need to check?
Well, it's only a static check, so we check that one's fitted, it isn't clearly inoperative, the dial glass is not broken or missing, and it can be illuminated so they can see it at night.
So if the dial glass had a small crack, would that be a fail?
Probably not. We'd only fail it if it was cracked to the extent that there was a possibility of misreading the speedometer, or if there was fouling of the indicator needle, or the cracked glass created a safety hazard.
And what about if a tachograph's fitted?
We treat that as a speedometer and check the items that I've just mentioned. We wouldn't open the tachograph head and check calibration stickers or anything like that.
You said there were a couple of items, so what else?
Glad you're listening, Robert. Tester needs to check what we call driving controls.
So what constitutes a driving control?
Well, basically any driving controls that are not covered by other sections of the manual. Clutch, gear lever, accelerator, engine stop, for example.
And driving controls are applicable to Class 5s only?
Exactly right, mate.
So what are the checks?
We check that any driving control is secure, functionally complete, not cracked, fractured or excessively corroded, that's not impeded in its travel or positioned so that it cannot be operated without impairing proper control of the vehicle.
And you mentioned the clutch earlier. Do we need to check the anti-slip provision?
Yes, mate, exactly right. And the checks are exactly the same as they are for the brake pedal rubber.
You also mentioned the engine stop and the accelerator. So what are the checks there?
Well, there must be a means of stopping the engine. It could simply be the ignition key, but there must be one and it must work.
And the accelerator?
Well, I just mentioned the accelerator as an example of driving controls. There's no specific checks on the accelerator, but any rubbish or other items that would interfere with proper control of the vehicle would be a reason for ejection.
So that's all there is to the driving controls?
Yes, it is, mate. And it's much easier than glazing, isn't it?
It certainly is. And what about the emissions tests on Class 5s?
Well, if it's a diesel, it's the same test. In the case of a petrol engine, we just have to remember that a different date applies in respect to carrying out a BET test. For a Class 5, it will be the 1st of August 1994, as opposed to Class 4's 1st of August 1992.
OK, so how about Section 8? Any Class 5 peculiarities there?
Well, we've already stated that we check Class 5 windscreens in Section 6.9, not 8.3. Apart from that, there's the mirror requirements for minibuses. But a minibus can just as easily be a Class 4 anyway.
So that's it then. I must say, though, there were more differences than I thought there would be.
Oh, yeah. And the fact that Class 7 testing stations can simply apply to become authorised to test Class 5 lightweights, it means that a lot more testers than ever before are becoming involved in testing Class 5s.